Welcome to the LaRouche Connection. My name is Webster Tarpley. Today, for the first time in the history of the LaRouche Connection, we are reissuing an earlier program because of its overwhelming importance to a controversy of today. You are about to see an interview with Cele Castillo, who was a Drug Enforcement Administration agent assigned to El Salvador during 1985 and 1987 at the height of the Iran-Contra drug running. This interview was originally taped about 2 years ago when Mr. Castillo came to the Washington area and made a series of interventions to denounce Oliver North, who in 1994 was a candidate for the United States Senate from Virginia. The drug running issue, as raised by Mr. Castillo and others, including Lyndon LaRouche, was one of the key factors that led to the defeat of Oliver North. Now you may ask, why is it so important today to hear about Mr. Castillo's investigation of the Ilopango Airport in El Salvador between 1985 and 1987? It is simply because the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and the way that it was organized by networks within the United States federal government are now, once again, the central political issue in the United States. As our regular viewers are aware, on August 18, 1996, the San Jose Mercury News began publication of a series of articles by investigative reporter Gary Webb dealing with the origins of the crack cocaine plague. Gary Webb focused on the activities of Contra leader Enrique Bermudez, Contra supporters and drug pushers like Danilo Blandon and Norwin Meneses Cantarero, and Freeway Rick Ross, the drug wholesaler who delivered the crack to street gangs like the Crips and the Bloods, who retailed it on the streets of Los Angeles. Gary Webb's story is a reliable picture of the Iran-Contra from the bottom up, as it appeared on the streets of America. Webb's story meshes with the most reliable top-down accounts of Iran-Contra. These include the study entitled Iran-Gate, the Secret Government in the LaRouche Case, published in June 1989, American Leviathan, Administrative Fascism under the Bush Regime, published in April 1990, and of course the definitive study, The Unauthorized Biography of George Bush. I am a co-author of all of these. New material has now been incorporated into a new EIR special report issued in the wake of the Gary Webb stories and entitled, Would a President Bob Dole Prosecute Drug Super Kingpin George Bush?, which has generated headlines all around the world, most especially in Latin America. And naturally, that question also goes to President Clinton. As Gary Webb says, his trail stopped at the door of the CIA, but the studies which I have mentioned show that the authors of these crimes were not the faceless bureaucrats of some generic and monolithic Central Intelligence Agency. This was the Bush machine, led by George Bush, Don Gregg, Oliver North, Richard Secord, Admiral Poindexter, Felix Rodriguez, and others. Bush was the kingpin, and he used the State Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, the National Security Council, and other agencies to pursue his crimes. Bush would be very glad to accept the abolition of the CIA in order to save himself at this point, and abolishing the CIA would accomplish very little. We want George Bush put away for life, and nothing less. So beware the loudmouth pseudo-radical who claims that the CIA is the real enemy. This is a diversion. And that, again, is where Cele Castillo comes in. He was back in Washington in late September to stress once again that this was a White House operation. And when Castillo personally confronted George Bush on the drug running and gun running in 1986, Bush walked away. These revelations have become more than big news. They have been a focus of a mass mobilization of the African-American community in this country. Congresswoman Maxine Waters and the Congressional Black Caucus have called for a serious investigation of the charges. At a mass meeting attended by thousands of people in Los Angeles, Congresswoman Waters got to the heart of the matter by accusing George Bush personally of involvement in this affair. General McCaffery, the drug czar, has announced his support for a reopening of the entire case. And CIA Director John Deutsch is under pressure for a finding. Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts is locked in a close re-election fight with Governor William Weld, whom the EIR Special Report has named as an integral part of the conspiracy run by Bush. During the Iran-Contra era, Senator Kerry ran an investigating subcommittee that made a serious effort at truth. Kerry has now told the Boston Herald that he was unable to pursue his probe after 1988 because of the hostility of the Bush White House. A headline of the final call, published by the Nation of Islam, reads, and I quote, "Drug pipeline, did Bush oversee covert CIA operations?" The answer is yes, and the one clear demand that emerges is the need for a real investigation. When Admiral Poindexter and Oliver North were fired from the National Security Council in November 1986, a cover-up began. Frank Carlucci and Colin Powell moved in and began to cover up with the help of David Apshire. Then came the Tower Board with Senator Tower, former Senator Muskie, and Kissinger's business partner Brent Scowcroft agreeing with a straight face that the guilty party was none other than White House Chief of Staff Don Regan, who was then duly fired as a scapegoat. Then came the joint congressional hearings of Dan Inouye and Lee Hamilton, another cover-up, this time masterminded by Wall Street lawyer Arthur Lyman. Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh did secure convictions for North and Poindexter, but they were overturned on appeal. That probe was shut down just before Christmas 1992, when lame duck President George Bush pardoned Caspar Weinberger, along with CIA agents Claire George, Duane Claridge, Alan Thiers, former NSC Director Bud McFarlane, and Elliot Abrams of the State Department. So this time, we need a real investigation. And so far, we have barely scratched the surface of the Iran-Contra case. There are now reports that the 1986 murder of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was the work of an assassin coming out of that milieu of the Bush machine where South African intelligence services rub elbows with the British Special Air Services under the aegis of Sir James Goldsmith and Tiny Rowland. It has long been clear that the Palme murder was linked to the Iran-Contra and its cover-up. Then there's the case of Uwe Barschel, the Prime Minister of the German federal state of Schleswig-Holstein, who was found dead in a hotel room in Switzerland, another murder linked to the Iran-Contra. Then there are the deaths of French General Audran and Italian General Giorgieri in 1985. It is very likely that all of the Iran-Contra wet work will soon come home to roost in George Bush's attic, and that all the trees in the forest may fall. But now, let us listen to Cele Castillo and his shocking story. Our guest today is Mr. Cele Castillo, a former agent of the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. Mr. Castillo comes from a military family. His father won a Bronze Star in the Philippines in World War II. Mr. Castillo himself is a Vietnam veteran who also holds the Bronze Star. During the Vietnam War, Mr. Castillo saw many of his fellow soldiers being destroyed by heroin. And out of that experience came his lifelong commitment to fighting drugs, which led him first to a career as a police officer and then as a DEA agent. During 1985 to 1987, the critical Contra years, Mr. Castillo was in the thick of things as the DEA agent responsible for El Salvador. In 1984, Mr. Castillo had taken part in Operation Condor, a joint U.S.-Peruvian-Colombian assault on narcotics production and trafficking. He was part of an operation that seized a large and important cocaine laboratory in Peru. Mr. Castillo has also had assignments in New York City, in elsewhere. Mr. Castillo is the author of a gripping and fascinating book entitled Powder Burns, Cocaine, Contras, and the Drug War, published by Sundial in 1994. The co-author is Dave Harmon. And we would like to welcome Mr. Castillo to the LaRouche Connection. And I'd like to go immediately to your book, very interesting book that you've put together. On page 132 of that book, you describe a kind of cameo appearance by Vice President George Bush. I believe this was in Guatemala City in January of 1986. and that would have been shortly after the inauguration of the new Guatemalan president, Cerezo. I'd just like to acquaint our viewers with that conversation, the events that led up to it, that followed it, and revolved around it, because this seems to sum up the heart of the matter.
Well, basically what happened there was that at that time, it was January 14, 1986, to be exact, George Bush was in Guatemala City. At the same time that George Bush was there, I also saw Caldero, head of the Contras, and Oliver North. And I met George Bush at the cocktail party at the ambassador's residence. And basically what he was doing was walking around, shaking hands with everybody. And he came up to me and asked me what my job description was as a DEA agent. And I told him that I conducted international narcotics investigation on traffickers down in Central America. And I also advised him that I was the agent that was in charge of reporting for El Salvador. And I forewarned him that there was some funny things going on at Ilopango airports with the Contras. He shook my hand, he smiled, and he just walked away from me without saying another word.
Okay.
From that day moment, I knew he knew something about the Contras.
That's what you're right. He simply smiled and walked away, seeking another hand to shake. After that exchange, I knew that he knew.
That's correct.
Now, what did George Bush know, and when did he know it?
Okay, before my arrival into Guatemala, we had received intelligence gatherings that the Contras were heavily involved in narcotics trafficking. Basically, I was forewarned by the country attaché in Guatemala, Bob Stia, upon my arrival, and told me that there was a covert operation being conducted by the White House and run by Oliver North at Ilopango Airport in El Salvador.
So this was your official superior in the DEA.
That's correct.
And the first thing he did when you arrived in country was to tell you, look, this is now the scene of a covert operation with Oliver North, and they're running drugs.
That's correct. Since we had obtained intelligence already about the Contras being involved, heavily involved in narcotics trafficking, he advised me to stay away from it and not to get involved in the investigation, because that would mean that it would be a short time for me to be kicked out of Salvador or Guatemala if I started reporting that information to Washington.
Now, when you say the Contras, does that mean all the Contras? Were there groups that were more into it, that were less into it? Was there Calero? There were others in that group? Was it a universal thing that all the Contras were into drugs?
It was a universal thing. DEA refused to accept that answer, but we had intelligence gathering from all parts of Central and South America in regards to the narcotics trafficking going on. We had cables from the country attaché, Bobby Nieves in Costa Rica, advising us to look into hangars 4 and 5 at Ilopango. And of course, hangar 4 and 5 were bought and paid for by the U.S. government, the CIA, and the National Security Council.
Okay, now Ilopango Airport, what is that? Is that a large commercial airport? Is it a...
No, Ilopango Airport is the military airport with civilian small planes that arrive at Ilopango. And basically, it's a military base, but most international pilots that fly small planes get to arrive at Ilopango.
And tell us what the atmosphere was at Ilopango in the middle of this Contra dirty war, 1985, 86, 87.
We had major narcotics trafficking going through Ilopango from Costa Rica.
That's further south.
Further south, the country of Costa Rica. We had obtained a lot of intelligence. We had an informant placed at Ilopango that actually did the flight plans for the pilots, the Contra pilots. And everybody spoke freely about the loads that they carried, the monies that they took to the Bahamas and to Panama for laundering. All this was reported to the U.S. Embassy, to the CIA, to Washington, DEA headquarters, and nobody wanted to do anything about it.
But tell me just briefly, what kinds of planes were these? Where were they coming from? Where were they going?
The cable that we received from Costa Rica in April of 1986 came in from the country attaché, Bobby Nieves, like I stated before, and was for us to check hangar 4 and 5, that they had very reliable information pertaining to the trafficking from around Central America and South America into those two hangars. Well, as it turns out, those two hangars, one was run by the CIA and the other one was run by Felix Rodriguez, who ran the Contra operation at Ilopango.
And these were not jets that you'd see at an American airfield, but these were smaller planes.
Smaller planes, yes, caravans, Pipers, Cessnas. They were coming in without being inspected by the customs officials or anybody else. As it turned out, the informant who did the flight plans actually gave us copies of all the flight plans of all these Contra pilots. And when we ran the names on all these pilots, they were all documented traffickers in DEA files as narcotics traffickers. Yet they were being hired by the CIA, Felix Rodriguez, and everybody else, trying to obtain U.S. visas for them to go to the U.S. Even though they were documented traffickers.
So these planes would then fly north, and could they make it all the way to what? To Miami?
They would go into Miami. They would go to Texas. They would go into California, anywhere that they were able. For example, we had a Contra pilot by the name of Chico Girola, who was arrested late of '85 in South Texas with $5.5 million cash. That was Contra money, and that's. You know, he carried credentials from the president of Salvador, from the chief of staffs in El Salvador, the chief of the Air Force, and so forth. They were all very well protected, and every single pilot talked about that they had permission to run narcotics because they were working for the Oliver North Contra operation.
Okay, now you've mentioned Felix Rodriguez Max Gomez. Now, I happen to have read his autobiography, and he's somebody who participated in the Bay of Pigs invasion back in the early 1960s, and it's speculated that George Bush was involved in that. And certainly Felix Rodriguez has been with George Bush for a very, very long time. And what you see in that book is he's got a signed photograph from George Bush telling him what a great patriot he is. Would you agree with that judgment on Felix Rodriguez Max Gomez?
No, sir. If we go back to the Vietnam War, we have intelligence where the CIA and those individuals were heavily involved in the trafficking in heroin into the U.S., body bags and so forth. So Felix Rodriguez was a documented in our DEA files as a trafficker. He was a retired CIA agent, and they brought all these people that were heavily involved with, if you go back, you look at most of these Bay of Pigs operatives were all documented traffickers. They've all served time for narcotics trafficking, for gun running. They were all criminals, yet they were being hired by the Oliver North Contra operation to run the illegal narcotics trafficking out of Ilopango.
Okay, now Felix Rodriguez has a DEA file.
That's correct, sir. I myself documented him involving traffickings with the Contras and so forth.
Now, does Oliver North also have a DEA file?
That's correct, sir. As a matter of fact, there's a 1991 file on Oliver North for smuggling weapons from the U.S. into the Philippines with known narcotics traffickers. And I'm talking about a 91 case. You know, I'm not going back to the Contra issue. I'm going back
after
the fact.
After the television appearance, after the great 1987 celebrity parade.
That's correct, sir. Absolutely.
And can you do a Freedom of Information Act and get a hold of Oliver North's DEA file?
I tried that already, and they cited the Privacy Act. I asked for my own files that I wrote on the Contras and different individuals, and they were denied.
So I can imagine that there would be a lot of voters around Virginia and elsewhere who would like to have a look at Oliver North's DEA file, again with an incident from 1991.
That's correct, but one of the questions I've always been asked, well, why can't the White House get that? There's something that somebody else has to answer that. I don't know. It's there. They just need to get that. That file's out of the Washington office here in Washington, D.C.
Well, that certainly makes you think twice. Now, did you ever see Felix Rodriguez running around Ilopango?
Yes, sir. I saw him run around Ilopango. I used to see him around the U.S. Embassy having lunch with the ambassador and either Colonel Steele from the Mill Group, commander down there. I see him everywhere.
And how about Oliver North? Did you ever see him there?
I saw Oliver North in Guatemala, not in Salvador.
And what were the circumstances where you saw Oliver North?
Well, that's when I met George Bush, on January 14, 1986, and basically Caldero was there, Bush, and they all met at the bubble, which we call the bubble, up on the 3rd floor, which is the CIA office up there.
In that embassy in
the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala City, that's correct.
Okay. Did you ever meet any of these other people? Did you ever see Poindexter running around?
No, I never did see him.
General Singlaub?
No.
But you knew of his activities?
Oh, yes, I knew the whole story. We had obtained, like I said before, extensive intelligence on narcotics trafficking and the Contras, and we had informants and so forth.
Okay, now on this, before we leave your informants, now you're not going to reveal any names of informants because this would put them in danger, but can you just give us an idea of what kinds of people were telling you about these activities and what they were telling you?
Okay, we had, we'll go back to Ilopango. We had an informant who had worked there at Ilopango for many years. He had given reliable information to the Consul General there, Robert Chavez, at the U.S. Embassy, and some cocaine had been seized before. So this guy was very reliable. He had been reporting all this activity on the Contras. And we had another informant who was also placed to work at Ilopango, Salvador, and Guatemala, who was a documented informant going back to 1981, and gave us a lot of the intelligence gatherings that we had on this Contra.
So these were two highly reliable sources,
highly reliable,
unimpeachable sources.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, let's now turn to what you did with the information that you got and how you reported it. I understand from your book that one of the first people you tried to tell about this was the U.S. ambassador to Guatemala, I believe, or was it Salvador?
Salvador.
Edwin Corr.
That's correct. Once we obtained a lot of the intelligence and we started writing reports, we went to the U.S. ambassador. We went to the CIA Chief of Station, Jack McCavitt, in Salvador, and Colonel Steele, who was the mill group commander. And this information, we had an individual who was an American who lived in Salvador who was a civilian. And as it turns out, he was working for the Oliver North Contra operation. And when we received all this information, we reported it to, I personally reported it to my boss, first of all, Bob Stia, who kept forewarning me about my reporting on the Contras because it was going to come back and hurt us in Guatemala.
Did he suggest it was going to be bad for your career?
It was going to be bad for my
dangerous
career
for you?
and his career, and he had a couple of years left to retire and not to make any waves. And I told him that if I actually found any evidence that I would continue to report the allegations that the Contras were involved in trafficking. I went to the U.S. Ambassador, Edwin Corr. He told me right off that it was a White House covert operation run by Colonel Oliver North, and for me to stay away from it.
So that's now the second time you got official testimony and corroboration that Oliver North was running these activities. First from Mr. Stia and then from Ambassador Corr. So two different agencies.
That's right. And then I went to Jack McCavitt, and Jack McCavitt's answer to me was the fact that they were being ordered to support the Oliver North Contra operation, just to go above and beyond to support them. And also Colonel Steele with the Mill Group, which of course he was the liaison officer from the U.S. Embassy into the Salvadoran military.
Now, Mr. Stia, your immediate superior, did he have the option of rejecting your reports, telling you to tear them up or file them or rewrite them, or did he have to sign off on them and send them to Washington?
It's one of the things a lot of people don't understand is the fact that every time I wrote a report or sent a cable out to Washington, it had to be approved by my supervisor, which was Bob Stia, and signed off by the ambassador of whatever country I'm sending that cable out to. So everything was approved. Whether DEA Washington did anything with it was a different story. And we had a place up there they called the Black Hole, where all these reports went in there, and They were never distributed to the right.
Is that up here at the Federal Triangle Metro stop?
That's correct.
Pretty close. And when did can you remember the date of your first dispatch to Washington that basically stated these facts about the...
We go back into early of 1986. We started, the cable came in from Costa Rica in April, so we continued to follow up on the request to conduct an extensive investigation into Hangar 4 and 5. And cable started coming and going. Costa Rica was giving us the information that the narcotics were leaving from a rancher's airstrip up there in Costa Rica into Ilopango. And of course, our informant at Ilopango was being told by the pilots when they were leaving, how much dope they were taking, how much money they were flying into the Bahamas or Panama. At one point, he saw $4.5 million cash taken from Ilopango into Panama to London. And this was incidents that were reported. We have a time and dates of one of the pilots, Chico Girola, departing El Salvador to the Bahamas, where he was airdropping monies on the Contras and the profits of narcotics trafficking.
And do you get the impression that the narcotics ultimately came from people like the Medellin cartel or the Cali cartel or people like this?
I had a CIA agent in El Salvador who actually came up and told me, how do you expect us to support the Contras when Congress cut aid to the Contras? How are they going to support themselves? Mm-hmm. Which means that we have to sleep with the cartels. And basically, during the Kerry report and committee hearings, we had a lot of informants, a lot of individuals who flew for the Contras. But basically, their credibility was not that good because they were traffickers, known traffickers, and so forth. But there was a lot of testimony, a lot of evidence to the fact that there was a lot of narcotics trafficking.
Okay, now you mentioned the Kerry Committee. I guess that's Senator Kerry of Massachusetts?
That's correct,
Senate
sir.
Investigating Committee 85, 86, 87?
Yes, sir.
You tried to tell part of your story to them, am I right? You tried to inform them of what you knew?
No, not the Kerry reports. As a matter of fact, it was October 22nd when I got a call in 87, when I got a call from Washington requesting for me not to close the files on the Contras because the Kerry Committee wanted copies of my reports, and under the Freedom of Information Act, if it's an open case, they cannot have access to it. We have, going back to, I like to say, during the committee, the Kerry Committee, we had Mark Richards, who is an assistant U.S. attorney. He was involved in a meeting with 25 individuals from DEA, Department of Justice, who refused to give this information to the Kerry report. We had DEA acknowledging that they would not return or not give up that information to the Kerry report.
This was the committee that investigated this Frogman operation?
Yes, that's correct, sir. We had the Frogman case going back to 85. A couple of Colombians and Nicaraguans that were trafficking in large quantities of cocaine into San Francisco. Frogman case come off as they would bring it in ships into the San Francisco area, and a couple of frogmen would go up there and take the coke. As it turns out, on their own testimony, testifying before the committee, they reported that the profits of that sales of narcotics was going to the Contras. So we start there. We have December of 85, we have Brian Berger from CNN who broke the story on the Contras involving narcotics trafficking. So the investigation into it started, but at no time did the Kerry Committee ever contacted the agents down in Salvador who actually conducted the investigation. I sat there and I waited for the phone to ring, and nobody ever called, so I could actually testify before that committee to advise them that there was large quantities of narcotics trafficking being conducted by the Oliver North Contra operation.
Now, you later also tried to get in touch with the special prosecutor Lawrence Walsh,
That's
appointed to look into this entire matter.
Yes, sir. Right before I left the agency in 91, I secretly met with Mike Foster, the FBI agent assigned to the Iran-Contra Walsh's committee, with my attorney present. He came and I gave him, he was just stunned when he saw copies of my reports, cables. His thing was the fact that he had asked the DEA, the Walsh's committee had asked and requested all this information from DEA, and DEA denied the fact that there were such reports. And basically, when I showed him there, he was just stunned, and he said, you know, if we can prove that the Contras and Oliver North were heavily involved in narcotics trafficking, it would be like a grand slam home run. We left at it that I would try to get this girl named Sandrita from Salvador into the U.S. so she could be briefed by the Walsh's committee in regards to her personal knowledge of narcotic use by some of the Contra pilots and some NSC individuals.
Well, it looks like you attempted at one point or another to bring your revelations, these charges, to the attention of the State Department, the Special Prosecutor, the FBI, the CIA. Did you ever talk to the Customs?
Yes, I sure did. During the, well, I'll have to go back to another story, but one of the things that the DEA has now acknowledged the fact that there's no such reports. Yet on the Kerry report, we have the DEA Deputy Chief, or the DEA Assistant Administrator, Dave Weststraight, acknowledging the fact that talking about the Nicaraguan war, it is true that people on both sides of the equation in the Nicaraguan war were drug traffickers, and a couple of them were pretty significant. Well, if DEA denies that, why is this man saying this? We have the CIA chief of the Latin American countries down there stating in the Kerry report, with respect to drug trafficking by the resistance forces, this is not a couple of people, it's a lot of people. So we have contradiction statements both from the State Department and the DEA to the fact that the Contras were heavily involved in narcotics trafficking.
Now, when you sent these reports into Washington, who in the DEA would get those on his desk?
Well, first of all, the chief of the Latin American countries was John Marsh, who is now, I understand, is the third-ranking DEA official. And
he's moving up the ladder.
He's moving up the ladder. He is the individual who is responsible for the cover-up of the Contras involving narcotics trafficking. He gave me a letter of a reprimand, I guess you could say, when I refused to stop reporting on the Contras involving narcotics trafficking. He actually wanted me to use the word alleged. I explained to him, how can I use the word alleged when I'm seeing all this that's happening in Ilopango? You know, we have reliable informants in there. We have, and he goes back, he went back and stated the same thing, that it would mean the end of my career in Latin America if I kept reporting this.
And I understand then the DEA actually investigated you, that is, they sent some people to check up on what you were doing?
That's correct. The pressure was on, the hammer dropped, as they say. They came down gunning for me. When Kike Camarena got killed in 85, the administrator for DEA came out with a memo stating that no DEA agent is to travel by himself in a foreign country. Yet that did not apply to me, because out of 2 agents to cover 4 countries in Latin America, which was Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, I was ordered.
2 agents for
2
4
agents.
countries.
That's correct.
And that was called the war on drugs.
That was called the war on drugs in Central America. And I was being forced to travel by land, mind you, through guerrilla territory.
What does by land means? In a car?
In a car.
On a country road.
That's
where guerrillas
correct.
are operating?
It's a 3 to 4 hour drive.
Did you have an armed escort?
No, sir. I drove by myself, and most of the time, my only backup was my informant, who traveled with me. And of course, DEA manual states that you cannot be with an informant by yourself. Yet DEA refused to give out any backup agents. That's what happened to Kike Camarena. Kike was by himself, having to work by himself. We had Victor Cortez meeting with an informant in a restaurant. He gets grabbed. Why? Because there was nobody to back him up. And where our lives were being put on the line up there, carelessly, by the DEA, and the DEA refused to do anything about it.
So the resources are totally inadequate. And
totally inadequate, unsafe.
Worse than that, though, doesn't it? It sounds like you had, somebody was trying to get you bumped off.
Well,
they would have been glad to see you bumped off.
That was at the very end of my career, where we have the OPR investigator, Tony Recevuto. We have a colonel who puts a contract on me, a Guatemalan colonel, who's going to assassinate me. We have tape recordings on him, how he's going to assassinate me in El Salvador and blame it on the guerrillas. And Tony Recevuto, senior inspector, goes into Guatemala and speaks to the U.S. ambassador there requesting a U.S. visa for this colonel so he can testify before the BCCI investigation in Miami. In other words, telling them that it's okay that he's going to assassinate me, but they want him to testify in a trial in Miami. And that's when I knew that I was going to get hurt sooner or later.
This would have fit into a kind of general liquidation of all sorts of people in 86, 87, 88 who were very knowledgeable about different sides of Iran-Contra. You can think of Olof Palme, you can think of people in
George
Germany.
Morales, and we have people that were being taken out.
Eyewitnesses were disappearing. They were dropping left and right in those years.
That's correct, and I was one of them that was going to be taken out by the DEA because they cannot justify the fact that this individual was going to assassinate me. There was a case out of Houston, Texas, that was conducting the investigation, yet my own people at DEA wanted to get him to the U.S. to testify. It was more important for them to testify before the BCCI investigation than my security. And mind you, the fact that everything, while I was down in Central America, or my career with the DEA, I kept a daily journal of everything. Case file numbers, natives numbers, individuals I talked to, people that called me, told me to close the files. Everything that the DEA had conducted illegally, condoling murders that the DEA knew about down in Central America, killings and the assassinations of Colombian traffickers, the massacre of them. I have passports to prove my allegations, and this was done with the knowledge of the DEA.
Now, you were accused at one point of fraternizing with your source, that you had gone native, so to speak. You'd gotten too chummy with the Guatemalan or Salvadoran police.
It's funny, when John Marsh came after me, I got suspended for 3 days for being close to my informant. Well, my informant in El Salvador was the advisor, okay? He was the advisor, narcotics advisor, that we hired, that we paid for at the Salvadorian police. He had police credentials. And because he's a police officer or he's a documented informant, we cannot be friends with him. And that's why I got suspended for 3 days for being too close to a guy that I was forced to work with in the first place, but yet he was a documented informant. I shouldn't get close to him, or I shouldn't be with him by myself.
It's impossible.
It's impossible, but you know, it was pressure that was being put on me by John Marsh.
Okay, now, to the bottom line, the net result of everything you sent in to DEA headquarters in Washington was what?
Was suppressed, I guess the word is. We acknowledged that with the CARE report. When they requested all this information, they refused to give it up. With the Walsh's committee, they refused to give it up. And to this day, they continue to cover up the fact that there was a lot of intelligence involving the CIA, involving Oliver North's Contra operation. I have pictures, I have photos, I have documents, I have everything that can justify what I'm saying. It's just the people refused to acknowledge the fact that this was going on. It was a cover-up being conducted by the DEA in orders from the White House.
Now, if you had to formulate charges against Oliver North, what would you charge him with?
Well, first of all, the violation of the federal narcotics law, which states in general the fact that if you have knowledge that narcotics trafficking is being conducted and you don't do anything about it, you can go to jail for that. That's a violation of the law.
If you're a government official or anybody?
A government official. We have letters from Owens telling him that narcotics trafficking was being conducted by the Contras.
This is Robert Owen, his courier.
His courier, his gopher, his whatever you want to call him.
Dog.
Okay, and then we have the CIA telling. We have memos from the CIA. We have all this, mind you, was reported also by CNN, Brian Berger, when he broke the story in '85. A lot of people told him, and he refused to do anything about it. He did not want to do anything about it. Even George Bush at one time made a statement to the fact that if the law is exactly to the fact that all those who look the other way are as guilty as the traffickers. Well, George Bush was looking the other way.
Okay, so North and others here violated the federal narcotics laws.
That's correct.
Anything else they violated?
Well,
any other charges?
We had a lot of investigations being conducted that the Contras were heavily involved. Felix Rodriguez knew that the Contras were involved. They
Sounds
came
like
in.
You've got a conspiracy.
There's a big conspiracy. This whole thing is like a big puzzle. It's there, but they just need to put it together. Maybe a congressional investigation will finalize the whole thing.
Okay, now, Oliver North says he's the most investigated man on the planet. He says, well, this is all done to death. We've been over this terrain 1,000,000 times. Nothing has ever been found. Do you think that the investigations up to now have been adequate on precisely this key topic?
No, sir, not at all. To start off with, it was an adequate investigation. Most investigative individual in the world. They should have contacted the agents in Salvador, okay? The people who actually conducted the investigation on the Contras. And I was the one who did that, and nobody ever came to me. I had piles and piles of reports, yet nobody came to look at those reports. Whether it was a cover-up, a conspiracy cover-up at the DEA and the White House, but it was never, nobody ever came. So if they would have come to me, I would have told them, he might just well be in jail right now with all the evidence that we had against him.
Have you found, I guess you mentioned this now in the course of our talk, but corroboration. Have you found other people, other sources who also can document what you saw?
Okay, I want to go back a little bit. In September of 1986, we had an individual who was an American, who was Oliver North's right-hand man down in El Salvador. He was a civilian. He worked out of Ilopango Hangar 4 and 5. He was a documented narcotics trafficker, all the way from Panama. We call him in the book as Basher, Mr. Basher. And we hit his house. I built a unit up there, and they hit the house. And at his residence, we found what was a Contra supply operation. We found U.S. military munitions, heavy guns, cases of explosives, C4.
In a private home?
In a private home, right. Now, cases of grenades, loss, sniper rifles, uniforms, military equipment, and it was all U.S. military issue, brand new, some of it. Before I hit his house, I went to the U.S. ambassador, who denied the fact that he worked for the U.S. Embassy. I went to the Mill Group commander, who denied that he worked for him. I went to the CIA, who denied. All three of those people told me that he was working for the Oliver North Contra operation. At the residence, all his vehicles had license plates to the U.S. Embassy. We found radios belonging to the U.S. Embassy. We found weapons belonging to the U.S. Embassy. Yet this individual was a narcotics documented trafficker working for the Oliver North Contra operation.
Now, if you had to go back and estimate, could you give some kind of a ballpark figure about how much drugs, I guess it means cocaine, pretty much in this case, how much cocaine, crack cocaine and other kinds of cocaine came into the United States as a result of these operations?
We had thousands of kilos that came in. We had surveillance set up there. We saw the planes coming in. We have reports where they came in. They dropped it off at Hangar 4 and 5, yet we were not allowed to touch it.
Could you just estimate, if at all possible, how much, what percentage that might have been of the total drug trafficking flow into the United States?
Maybe 1%, and that's a lot. 1% is a lot. Now, you're asking me about monies, millions of dollars. Like I said, we have two incidents. One in South Texas in '85 by a Contra pilot named Chico Girola, $5.5 million cash, and a clandestine airstrip in South Texas. Okay, he's a documented trafficker, a documented Contra pilot. We have a guy who was an honorary ambassador to Panama, who flew $4.5 million from Ilopango into Panama. This was reported to DA Washington. So we had a U.S. Customs agent by the name of Richard Rivera, who I brought down from Mexico City to assist me in trying to trace these munitions that we found. And he was told to back off the investigation, and they justified by changing the jurisdiction of Mexico into Panama. So Panama was now in charge of the investigation, and of course we were never able to trace these cases of grenades, cases of C4, weapons, everything that we should have done. We should have gotten cooperation on the Pentagon to finalize our investigation and possibly the arrest of Felix Rodriguez and Oliver North. And we were never allowed to do that.
But that was something that you would have been interested in doing, arresting them
absolutely
red-handed with all of this.
Violation of the federal narcotics law, the Neutrality Act, aid to the Contras when it was illegal.
Now, later on, George Bush, towards the end of his term in office, came along and pardoned quite a number of the top figures in this. And I guess that had the effect of shutting down most of what was left of the official investigation. What do you think of George Bush pardoning, essentially, these people?
George Bush was trying to save himself, and by pardoning these people who were known traffickers, was a slap in the face for the example of we as DEA agents were out there putting our lives on the line, going undercover on military third world countries.
And you've done undercover operations in Central America yourself.
That's correct, and so we could have another branch of our government heavily involved in narcotics trafficking was just devastating to me. And a lot of people go into the government and spend 20 years and then retire. It didn't take me 20 years to figure out that my own government was heavily involved in narcotics trafficking and putting our lives on the lines. And just a couple of weeks ago, we lost 5 agents in Peru that were not doing, they couldn't justify what they were doing. We cannot work with the third world countries that are heavily involved in narcotics trafficking. We had documented reports on the third world countries. For example, Guatemala. Guatemala is heavily involved in narcotics trafficking. The Vinicio Cerezo government was heavily involved, sleeping with the cartels. Yet it was a democracy, and the U.S. government did not want to do anything about it. I went undercover in a congressman down there. He was going to sell me 200 kilos of cocaine, and when it came down to arrest him, I was told by the U.S. Embassy not to arrest him because we were not there to embarrass the Guatemalan government, but we were there to help them. Same thing happened in Salvador. All the weapons that were being seized by the guerrillas were being sold to the cartels. So we spent $1.5 million a day in El Salvador for the past 10 years, and they couldn't win the war.
Well, let's sum up now. We have a few minutes left. Do you think that Oliver North is qualified to be a United States Senator?
No, he is a convicted felon. He lied to Congress. He's a chronic liar. He lies to everybody. A lot of people feel that he can be forgiven for what he did, but what I don't think that they realize is the fact that he cannot justify for the narcotics trafficking that his organization conducted in the 80s, and he cannot guarantee me to the fact that nobody or none of those drugs that were being smuggled into the U.S. that people died of were not Contra cocaine. So he's got to take responsibility for what is happening in our streets today. All the narcotics, cocaine epidemic that we have. We have more cocaine now in the U.S. streets than we did 10 years ago. Yet we spend billions of dollars in third world countries trying to combat this trafficking, and the best results is education, but Oliver North should be in jail and not be running for the U.S. Senate.
And of course, it's ironic that you have self-styled religious leaders, people who claim to be men of the cloth, even coming out to support somebody who was engaged in all these activities.
Well, I don't think they really know the real truth behind the whole incident. We have recordings. We have Richard Rivera, who's the U.S. agent that conducted the investigation with me on the Contras, going publicly, admitting and helping me out, stating what I'm saying is true. We have all this. What more do they want? You know, there's documents. They want to know. They go to DEA and get those documents. We have documentation where Oliver North is being investigated in '91 for smuggling weapons into the Philippines. He continues to have a criminal enterprise.
A continuing criminal enterprise.
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, I have to ask you, you left the DEA, what, 4 years ago?
That's correct. I retired on a disability in June of 1972.
And what is your occupation now?
Right now, I'm a parent volunteer at my kids' school, and I do private investigative work in Texas, licensed by the state of Texas. And I went back to painting. I'm an artist.
Now let me ask you, given your experience of these long cross-country drives through guerrilla country in Central America, back when you were with the DEA, you realize that the kind of revelations you're making now are dangerous. And given that danger, why do you come forward?
Because, like Oliver North, I took an oath to follow the Constitution of the United States. And if my life is in danger and I am to die, I've lost my family. He still has got his family. I went through a divorce. I lost everything because I believed in the system. I believed in my government. And now I don't have anything but myself.
Now, would you think that the Virginia voters ought to have the right to see Oliver North's DEA file?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's there. Whether the DEA wants to continue the conspiracy to cover it up, it's a different story. They can hide under the National Security Act. They can hide under the privacy law. And basically that's what they're doing, because I have filed for those records and they had denied. This is records that I wrote myself, reports I conducted, investigations I conducted. They refused to give, and they're closed files already. So there is a continuing cover-up by the DEA.
And the person would be, I guess, Mr. Marsh?
That's correct.
Or others?
Or others, and like I said, Mr. John Marsh was the agent in charge of the Latin American countries. He's the one that forewarned me to stop reporting on the Contras, to use the word alleged more, and it's stating that I was using poor grammar after 10 years with the agency. And of course I have all this documentation to prove my facts.
Now you tried to tell your story inside the federal agencies for quite a number of years. We've seen with very limited results. And then you turned to your book, Powder Burns.
That's correct.
What made you decide to get into writing books?
I was sick to my stomach when I saw Oliver North up there. Everybody looked at him as a hero, Oliver North for president and so forth. I had to tell my story. Whether people want to buy my book, fine. If they don't, I can live with myself now. He has to hide what conscience he has, or does his family have, that they know that his organization is responsible for a lot of deaths in the U.S., for the epidemic cocaine addiction that we have. What does his family think about, you know?
Well, I understand you were going out on the stump in Virginia now in the closing days of the election campaign.
Yes, that's correct. I've always been I've always made the assumption that I'm going to go out there and try. I've never quit. I'll go out there, tell them what I know. People want to listen to me, I'm there. If they don't, it's a prerogative. It's a free country. If they want to select or elect an official who is a documented trafficker and a felon, convicted felon, then it's a prerogative.
Now you have a final thought that you wanted to leave us with.
That's correct. I have a quotation from a very fine artist or a fine actor, and it reads as follows: whenever you have a group of individuals who are beyond any investigation, who can manipulate the press, judges, and members of our Congress, you are always going to have in a government those above the law. And Oliver North was above the law in narcotics trafficking.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much. Our guest today has been Mr. Cele Castillo, former agent of the Drug Enforcement Administration. I think as a result of the conversation we've had, many people are going to be demanding that Oliver North's DEA file finally be made public. And I guess after this, many people can answer for themselves the question whether Oliver North ought to be in the United States Senate, and indeed the larger question, if our country really needs a comeback by the Bush machine. My name is Webster Tarpley. This has been the LaRouche Connection. Thank you, and see you next time.